Welcome to this presentation on understanding the difference between children's and adult services, why they are different, and how this may affect you and your young person. Having heard this presentation, you may be left with questions. If those questions are of a general nature, or you don't know who should be answering them, then please contact the Devon Information Advice and Support DIAS. Their telephone number is on the slide. If your question is for either adult social care or children's social care, please contact by sending an email to the web addresses as detailed. My name is Liz Wood and I'm the Assistant Director for People with Disabilities within Adult Social Care. Unfortunately, my colleague Jonathan Mitchell, who works for Disabled Children's Services, is unable to be part of this presentation recording today. So what topics are we going to cover? What is meant by transitions? We use that word in a number of different settings, so we'll go through those. Why children and adult social care are different? And what does that difference mean for people with disabilities? So what period of time are we talking about? We're looking at that time when the young person is moving from being a child in the family to being an adult. It's a time when they're developing their own identity and independence. And this is particularly complex if you've got disabilities and are reliant upon other people for certain aspects of making sure that you are safe, healthy, and fulfilled. It's a time when you start to have greater emotional turbulence. You have hormonal changes. There are things that are going on within your body that you cannot control, and you may not understand why that is happening and how to deal with it. It's a time when your social circles are expanding, when you're looking outside of the family for support. And if friendship comes easily to you, then that's great. But if you have a learning disability and you need help to actually go and meet your friends, then that makes it a little bit more complicated and it needs planning and organising. You need support to be able to do that. It's a time when often the independence that the young person is asserting can look like rebellion. I remember a friend of mine commenting on how the house shook when her daughter slammed a door and disappeared off. How do you do that? How do you assert your independence if you're physically unable to do that? It's a time when you'll be experiencing physical changes. For a woman, your periods will be starting. For a man, your voice will be breaking. And this can be very disconcerting and quite distressing if you haven't been told how to cope with it, the fact that this is even going to happen and what to do if it does. Some young people don't experience these physical changes, and that in itself can be distressing when they realise that they're different to their peers. It's a time when young people take more risks. They're starting to learn to make their own decisions. They're starting to have to problem solve for themselves. Those risks can sometimes be very risky. If your young person finds drugs or starts to drink a lot or has sexual relationships that are frequent, then that in itself brings an enormous amount of risk. And they're doing this while their brain is still developing. You hope that most of the time they'll be taking risks that aren't that serious. So it's a time when they are making mistakes and learning through those mistakes, and this will help them in later life when they don't have access to yourselves to talk it through. But it's also a time of great opportunity. It's a time when they could be thinking about what they want to do when they leave education and start to steer their educational career so that it supports whatever job they want to do in the future. So what do we mean by the word transitions? In services, we tend to use it interchangeably, which can cause confusion. So it's used when a young person is moving from being a child in the family to being another adult in the family. We also use the words preparing for adulthood. Other people have other names for it. It might be your granny saying, doesn't he grow up quickly? Or it could be you thinking, this is a difficult time. But every young person does that move. They move from being a child in the family to being an adult. We also use it when we're talking about moving within a service. So one example of this is from primary school to secondary school and from secondary school to college. And everybody does this within mainstream education. In fact, you're learning things through those moves. But it doesn't always happen in special schools, and that can be significant because if it doesn't happen, then the learning that they would have done has to be supplied in another way. And the third use is when we talk about moving from one service to another. So from children's social care to adult social care, or from children's health to adults' health. Everybody does this again, but it has a much bigger impact on the lives of those who are heavily reliant upon either social care or health within their everyday life. So on this slide, I'm going back to the middle one of the three uses of the word transition. One where you're moving through a system. And here I'm looking at education. So what is it that a child is learning as they move through the different stages? Within primary school, a child is directed and supervised at all times. Although they'll go out to the playing field for certain sports subjects, written subjects like English, maths and science are all taught in one classroom. Primary schools introduce the child to the concept of being in a structured environment where there is a routine. They're expected to behave in a certain way and to meet certain expectations. When they move up to secondary school, the young person starts to take on more responsibility for themselves. They have to follow a timetable to be in a right place at the right time with roughly the right equipment for the subject that is in that time slot. As they choose their options, the curriculum becomes much more subject specific. It's around the young person exploring the things that they are most interested in and those that will help them with whatever they plan on doing after they leave education. And there is a lot of talk about jobs and steering the options that they choose to support them with their future career. Moving on, when they leave compulsory education at 16, they'll go to further education college or university or an apprenticeship. Here they move towards guided learning hours. And if you look at the government guidance, government says that full-time education is about 580 hours per year, which equates to 3 days a week. For the rest of the time, the student is expected to manage their own learning. They're again taking responsibility, this time for their own productivity as well as their behaviour. And all of these are the soft skills that you need within the employment environment. I'm now looking at the final meaning of transitions that we're going to look at today, which is the difference between children's and adult social care. And the main difference is the legislation that we operate under. So children's social care operate under the Children's and Families Act, which is all about maintaining the family. The family is responsible for keeping the child safe, healthy and thriving, which is exactly what's needed when you're 5. And for most families, there will be no expectation of a financial contribution towards the cost of the support. If consent is required for something, then it will be to the family that children's social care will turn. Adult legislation is the Care Act 2014, and this piece of law is all about the adult making their own decisions. Family support is still very important, but what we're looking at is another adult within their midst being supported. It is for the adult who's being supported to take responsibility for keeping themselves safe, healthy and fulfilled. When the young person turns 16, it will be to them that we will turn to for consent. If they're unable to consent, then we will undertake a best interest decision on their behalf. And we'll be looking to them to agree to an assessment taking place. The only caveat to that is if the young person is likely to be at risk of abuse or neglect, and then we have a duty to complete a Care Act assessment regardless of whether the young person consents or not. The adult will be financially assessed when they turn 18. So your young person will be financially assessed when they turn 18 if they start to receive funded support. And there may be a requirement to pay a contribution towards the cost of that support. As a carer of an adult, you are eligible for a Carers Care Act transition assessment in your own right. You can ask for this when your young person has turned 17 and a half. Any support you will receive will be only available when they turn 18. It doesn't matter what your young person decides in the way of consent to their own assessment. You can still request a Carers Care Act assessment in your own right, even if they say no thank you to an assessment for them. On this slide, we want to talk about the Mental Capacity Act and decision making. Although there is a later session within this set of webinars, we wanted to touch upon it within this presentation as it is such a fundamental difference between how children's services operate and how adult services operate. The law is complicated and there are many decisions that need to be made within education, health and social care as you move between being a child and into the adult world. Generally in children's services, the young person's views are sought and considered. However, the adults within the family who are exercising parental responsibility are often the ones to make the significant decisions about the support that is received. When the young person turns 16, then the Mental Capacity Act says that they will make those decisions in their own right. Each decision is decision specific, and there are times when there may be reason to doubt that young person's ability to be able to make that decision. At this point, an assessment will be undertaken that will look at that very specific decision to see if they do or don't have capacity. Where the young person doesn't have capacity, then a best interest process will be followed. And within that best interest process, the views of the parent carer are very important. The preferences of the young person are also incredibly important. But ultimately, the professional requiring the decision becomes the decision maker. I have heard young people who did have capacity say when they turned 18, I can't do this. I can't fall back on my family. I have to do this by myself. That's not strictly true. You are still there to offer advice and support. And of course, they can talk to you about what that decision looks like. But ultimately, the decision that they make will be the one that we will go with. On the previous slides, we've been looking at what we mean by the words transitions as services, but also at the differences in the legislation. Here, we're looking at the journey that the young person goes through as they mature and become an adult. And basically, I'm using Maslow's hierarchy of needs to try and illustrate the journey that the young person goes on. Maslow says that you need all the things at the bottom of this pyramid to be able to concentrate on the things at the top. So you need to feel that you've got food, shelter, fluids. You know that those basic needs are going to be met, that you feel secure and protected before you can concentrate on building relationships and your sense of connection. It's only when you've got those that you can really start to have confidence in yourself. And with your confidence grows your ability to be able to set goals and think about what you want to do within your life. I have simplified this enormously, but roughly between the ages of 0 to 11, all of this is within the family. Family members will be the ones to make sure that there is food on the table and a roof over their head. They will supply that sense of protection. It will be within the family and the relationships that you as parents have that their sense of belonging comes from. You'll be helping them feel confident, and you'll have set a lot of their growth and goals. Moving on to the age of adolescence, we've already said that this is a wonderful time of exploration and starting to take on some of these aspects for themselves. They're still looking to the family for the roof over their head and food on the table, for their safety and security, and for a sense of belonging. But they're also starting to look outside of the family. They're looking to their friends for their social connections and to widen those. What their peer group thinks of them becomes much more important, and they're starting to take on their own responsibility for their own growth and goals. One of the questions we get asked is, how do we do this if the person has very high levels of disability? For instance, if they're non-verbal, how can they express what their growth and goals are? To be able to do this, you do need to be able to communicate. And for some people, it is going to be a case of sorting out from their communication your best guess as to what that would be for them. So if you've got somebody who is non-verbal, you need to write down what they are communicating when they make a particular gesture or when they make a particular noise. You need to make sure that that communication is then accurately understood. I've often sat with people and asked a whole group of professionals and family what the person is trying to communicate when they make a particular facial feature, particular facial expression. And sometimes I will get quite a range of answers as to how people respond to it. At that point, the individual isn't actually communicating. And one of the first things is to make sure that when they make a particular facial expression or gesture or noise, that that is responded to in a consistent way, and that it's understood that that's what they're trying to communicate. Having done that, you can then look at what they enjoy, because you're all agreeing on what that enjoying facial expression looks like. And you can work out your best guess at what their goals would be within life and start to explore that by giving them the opportunity to try things and seeing what their facial expression looks like and whether they've enjoyed it or not. And so you start to move them to a point of them having more of a sense of self, where you're planning around them and what they're really enjoying and wanting to do in the future. We're now looking at the adult still living within the family home. So the family is still providing the roof over their head, as in shelter and warmth, and probably most of the food. However, the young person is now starting to take some of this on and is being expected to keep their bedroom clean at least, and they'll be cooking when they come in late. They start to take on responsibility for their own sense of safety. Instead of you as a family member being able to say, please be back by 9 o'clock, they're going to be telling you, I'll probably be back about midnight. They're hopefully still in a good relationship with you and still have a strong sense of belonging, but they'll also be continuing to extend their social connections through the workplace and through their social life. Hopefully they're still confident and enjoying life through that and continuing to build upon their growth and goals. When the young person has disabilities, again, this needs more planning. I'm often asked about people who have cognitive disabilities and how they can take on their own sense of safety and security. And a lot of this does need to be done in small steps where they're able to practice it and where they're able to come back and have a conversation or ask somebody if things don't quite go according to how they thought they should. If people don't practice, then they don't learn to problem solve. And if they don't learn to problem solve, then the first time something happens, it is incredibly difficult and more likely to go horribly wrong. So having the opportunity to practice while they still have you as a family supporting them and giving them information and advice is important. And the final slide in this part of the presentation is about the adult being in their own home, and here they're taking on the physiological needs because they're putting the food on the table and they're paying the bills. When a person has a disability, each person will go on a different journey to get to this point, and that is why planning is so important. The aim is that the individual will take on as much responsibility as they can for each and every area. Where they're able to learn how to do it, they do so. And where they cannot learn, perhaps because they physically cannot do the task, that is met in a way that still enables them to take as much responsibility as they can. If we take food, for instance, the young person may be unable to cook, but they can still decide what food that they wish to eat. They may be able to do the internet shopping. The support that goes in will be to help them put food on the table that they enjoy eating. And the same is true for each of these areas, which is why it is so important that we sit down and do the planning. Young people need to be given the opportunity to practice taking responsibility, to learn the things that they can learn, and for there to be a clear plan about how they will be supported with those things that they cannot do. I've been asked about where the Mental Capacity Act comes into this pyramid. There are an awful lot of decisions that are made in each of these sections. If you think about the section at the bottom about food, for instance, it may be about what meal you're going to take out of the freezer tonight to eat tomorrow. It may be about, if you haven't enough money, making a decision on which bill you're going to pay first. When it comes to safety and security, everybody is making decisions all the time around this. You will often be checking whether you feel safe and thinking about what you need to do to keep yourself safe. Going to the top of the pyramid, you may not think every day about this, but every so often you will stop and think, actually, I want something different in life. What new goals am I going to set myself? Each of these are decisions that need to be made, and if there is doubt about the young person's ability to make the decision, the Mental Capacity Act will apply. As I said on the previous slide, planning is absolutely crucial to enabling the young person to make a successful transition from being that child within the family, accessing children's services, through to being an adult, accessing adult services. And we know that that can be complicated. Operating under different legal systems can be very confusing. It's therefore very important that we start to talk about the future early to ensure that this transition is as smooth as it can be. It's important that we think about what is important for the young person, that they are at the very centre of this transition process, and that what they aspire to do within their life is part of that discussion. When you're thinking about what they want in the way of independence, they need to think about their education and what it is that is going to be focusing on to help them achieve their goals, their careers when they enter work. You need to think about their current health needs. They'll be moving from a single professional in the form of a paediatrician to having access to a number of specialists if they've got a number of health conditions. And within adult social care, they'll be expected to take responsibility for some of their decision making and to be telling us what it is that they need. So having said that we're going to start the planning early, you need to be talking to the professionals about what is the difference between children's and the adult offer. And to do this, you can approach adult social care. You can either fill in the referral form, I'll come later to how you access that, or you can go to the website that I originally said on the first slide and put in a question to the mailbox there. You need to talk to the school about the educational opportunities that are available to the young person and what are they going to be focusing on as they take their options, just as you would for any other young person. Encourage your young person to speak up for themselves and to make their own decisions. You can be doing this from a very early age. Encourage them to think about what it is, and to some extent let them take the consequences of their decisions, because that's how we make mistakes without them being put unduly at risk. Get them to practice some of the skills. So I come on to it later about being very practical, but if they're going to be engaging with wheelchair clinics, for instance, then get them to make the appointment as they begin to get older. Get them to be the person who engages with the professional while you're still in the background to help them think through the questions they want to ask and to understand the answers that they get given. Encourage them to link in with peer groups and other community groups. This can be incredibly difficult, particularly for young people if they've got social anxiety. They're in their bedroom. How do you connect them in with their peer groups and community groups? There are online groups, but also go and talk to professionals about how you can encourage your young person out of their bedroom. What is it that can be done to help them reduce their social anxiety and to be able to make those first steps back out into the world? This is very important, although these days with the internet, a lot of life can be done within one setting, like a bedroom. They can engage with their peers, they can have education through that means. There are still certain things that are not possible, and if they get toothache, then there is no way that the dentist is going to be able to do a filling in their bedroom, so they need to be encouraged out, and getting professional advice on the best way of being able to do that and to start that journey is vitally important. So talk to professionals about the plan. Talk to your young person about what they want to achieve. Talk to the professionals and your young person about the best way of achieving it. What are the steps? You can have big goals and then break those down into smaller goals that are going to be achieved within that year, and then keep checking that it's working. Be as detailed as you need to within your planning. As I've said, there was one young person who had their plan and it was 90 pages long, and their parents said even then they hadn't covered everything. So when their young person left home, they used to get phone calls and the young person would say, "How do I do this?" And Dad would say, "Have you looked in the plan?" The next stage was the young person rang him up and said, "I've looked in the plan and it's not in there," at which point they started planning. Now his young person is ringing him up saying, "I've looked in the plan, it's not there, and this is what I think needs to happen." And eventually, I'm sure they will get to the point where Dad doesn't even receive a phone call. But that's a very detailed plan. That's about using that plan to help the young person move into independence. And within that plan, thinking about Maslow's hierarchy of needs, there are even more things to think about than perhaps most young people have to. So think about the practical aspects. Think about every single thing that you do within your life and that they're going to have to do, from changing the bed through to making appointments within health that can be complicated if you have lots of health appointments. Think about all of those things and how they're going to happen, and how the young person is going to be able to take on what they can learn to do, and you can give them practice at now, and what you're going to need to organise support for if you're not going to do it as when they become an adult. Don't forget about yourself within all this. You are vitally important. So as a parent, a carer, or if you are a young carer, look after yourself. Think about the support that you need and your own transition plan within this. There is another section within this webinar about it, but it's also important you think about what your life is going to be like, how it's going to be different when your family member is an adult or your family member is no longer at home. This can have quite positive impacts, but it can also have some negative impacts for some families. For instance, if you rent a property and you're on benefits, then having somebody leave home means that you end up with an extra bedroom. And at the moment, that then gets taken into account with the amount of money you have for your housing benefit as to whether all those bedrooms are filled, for instance. And please remember that as adult social care, we are here not just to do assessments. We have a duty to provide information and advice. So please make contact either through that web address or by picking up the phone or by contacting us through the referral form. Ask us questions and we will do our best to answer them. That is the end of the main webinar. However, we wanted to leave you with some useful information, and within this slide there are links to other documents. The first link is a link to the referral form for the Transitions Adult Social Care team. If you're thinking that you would like to put in a referral, please do. Anybody can, with the consent of the family or the young person, unless you consider that young person to be at risk of abuse or neglect, and then you can do it without consent. The more people who request support, the better. As far as we're concerned, we'd rather receive more referrals than have somebody not access our help. The second document is about the Care Act 2014, and it gives a simplified guide to who is likely to be eligible, as produced by the Social Care Institute for Excellence. The third document is around the Mental Capacity Act. The fourth document is our Transitions Guide for Devon, and it aims to look and give you an idea of what each service needs to do at each stage of the transitions journey, so from age 14 through to 25. And it looks at education's responsibility, social care's responsibility, and health's during those different time periods. And the fifth document is specifically focused around moving between health services. That brings us to the end of this presentation. A big thank you to everybody who shared their expertise and helped us bring this together. We hope you found it useful, and we'd love to hear from you via the feedback form using the QR code below. Your input will help us improve and shape future sessions. We are planning on doing further webinars. There have been requests for a webinar on supporting neurotypical adults and a second on supporting people who have more complex needs. We'll look at how we plan these into the future. In the meantime, it just falls to me to say thank you very much for taking your time to listen to this presentation.